Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Bible from North Congregational Church in Farmington Hills, Michigan. I'm the Reverend Dr. Mary Biedron, Senior Minister of North Church, and it's nice to be back from vacation and to be getting back into my recording and also my live program schedule. I will be doing Wednesday Inspiration tomorrow, the 19th, live, and of course, I will be live and in person on Sunday, the 23rd, as we will think about the nature of unity in the church. Meanwhile, our march through the books of the Bible and the genres and the material that's in this library, this biblios, has now brought us to the book of Acts. And the Acts is an interesting book because it's really a lot of different things. It's got some historical material, quite a bit. It's also got some spiritual stuff. It's got some evidence of the worship practices of the early church. It's got a lot. It's classified as a history book, but it stands separate, obviously, from the history books of the Hebrew Bible, in that it's got a little more reach into the future, I'm going to say, than a lot of the others. So in some sense, it's also prophetic. So Acts is, if you had to just say, what is the Acts of the Apostles about? It is about the dynamic of the church once they turn direction over to the work of the Holy Spirit that comes upon them in the second chapter of the book of Acts. It could actually be called Acts of the Holy Spirit, and probably nowadays, if we were creating that title, we might call it that. But in the view of the author of Acts and in the view of the church community, the unity of the apostolic charge of the work of the apostles, those called to be apostles by the Spirit, and this work of the Spirit are absolutely united. And actually, I spent quite a bit of time in my doctoral paper talking about the whole idea that in Acts, decisions are always made in consultation with the Holy Spirit. And you see that in Acts chapter 15, which was my big thing. It also describes some of the controversies of the early church, and those get an even more vivid depiction in the letters of Paul. We'll get to epistles next week. But meanwhile, the book of Acts was written as a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. So it has a connection with Luke's Gospel and a time frame that is certainly not prior to Luke's Gospel, but is along with it. And it begins with Theophilus. In my first book, I told you all about the things that Jesus did, and now I want to tell you about all the things that the Holy Spirit has done, basically. There are some different aspects to it. There are some we passages, we being where the narrative suddenly, particularly in the ocean journeys of Paul, says we went here and we did this and we waited there. And some scholars think maybe that's because they're fragments of a travel diary kept by either the Apostle Luke or someone who is recording the life of the Apostle Luke. As we've said before, all four of these Gospels that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are attributed to specific apostles, but their writing really indicates that they may be like the school of thought of those apostles or the writing down of their gospel story. And much is also the same about the book of Acts, that there's several different historic accounts that have different sources, and some of them have different sources reflected elsewhere in the Bible, most notably in the epistles of Paul, which are much earlier than Acts, right? They're one of the few completely contemporaneous things in the New Testament. Acts comes later, and so it was probably written down about 65 to 67 in the Common Era in Anno Domini, but now we call it the Common Era, because it talks about Paul's imprisonment in jail and his final imprisonment in Rome, but it does not talk about the martyrdom of Paul, which happened after about 67. And that's an important category because so much of the book of Acts is tied up with the story of Paul that scholars find it hard to imagine that it would not include something about his martyrdom. That we have, from church history itself, from historical documents written like the Shepherd of Hermes, and well, there's quite a lot of different things. But for our purposes, Acts is going to be written AD 65 to 67, before the destruction of the temple, before the martyrdom of Paul. And it is it's actually a really ripping yarn. It's a great story. It doesn't get enough treatment. We don't. It doesn't come up in the lectionary as a lengthy period of study. I think because some of the things that happen are repetitive. But years ago, I had a youth group that was raising money in another city. A youth group that was raising money for a project that they wanted to undertake, and so they got pledges for a rocking chair reading marathon, and the marathon that they read was the book of Acts. So they sat down in rocking chairs and passed the Bible around and read the book of Acts and then recorded how many hours it really took. Now, I don't remember how many hours it really took. What I do remember is how much the students learned from just that particular charge to read a book of the Bible that doesn't have as many hard passages. You know, when people start with Genesis, they've got all those begats, and they've got Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy have all these details of the law. Acts is really a story of action. It's a story of what happened and how the gospel, against all odds, against lots of efforts to tamp it down, to smash it, to wipe it out, culminated in the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the Jerusalem church. But Acts is really concerned with how everything spread out from the Jerusalem church out into particularly the known world. And later in the epistles of Paul, we'll see why it didn't spread into Asia from Asia Minor so quickly, and instead went to Greece. It's really viewed as a divine direction, but we are here because these things happened, the church today. So we have main characters. Really, the most main character of the book, who's through the whole thing, is God in the person of the Holy Spirit. So Acts begins with Luke saying, Theophilus, I told you all these things, and now I need to tell you about all sorts of other things. And so it includes the ascension of Jesus, when they say, Lord, is this the time when you're going to take over all the world and you're going to do that? And Jesus says, wait and go and spread the good news. Several of the Gospels end that way as well. And then they go back to Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away, and they go up and they wait upstairs, and Peter is drawing them together. So Peter has already a connection with the Holy Spirit in this narrative before the gift of the Holy Spirit. And that's one of those things where we think that there's several pieces of various other records put together for Acts. So Peter gathers the believers and they start doing business. And the second chapter of Acts is really the big event, one of two big events, the second being the conversion of Paul. But is the day of Pentecost comes, and I got my red on today, but the day of Pentecost comes, the festival of weeks in Judaism, and the apostles are waiting in a room, and suddenly the Holy Spirit comes down, and wind and fire, just like creation, the wind, the pneuma blowing, and pneuma is the word for wind and spirit, both. And then the fire, or something similar to fire, like the apocalyptic things, the descriptions sometimes are not literal, but they use literal images because they don't know what else to say. What we do know is these followers of Jesus who had run away when he was crucified, who faltered trying to come back to him even after resurrection, these guys who didn't believe the women when they came and said that Jesus had risen from the dead, these folks who didn't get the meaning of Jesus's parables, and who in some senses really had beginner's mind all through the Gospels, suddenly find themselves empowered to tell this story, and empowered in such a way that they are no longer afraid of whatever they must suffer for the gospel, whatever they must suffer for the sake of the Spirit, because they feel secure in their knowledge that they are alive in God's love no matter what happens to them in this world. The book continues, and it's got a lot of things about Peter and John, about the efforts of both the Roman Empire and also the political leaders of Jerusalem, the Jewish political leaders, not out of their faith so much as out of their political necessity, tried to squash this out, to imprison it. And we meet the character of Paul, who will be writing a whole lot of letters in our coming weeks. And Paul is actually known as Saul at that point, named after the failed first king of Israel. And he's fervent. He's a fervent persecutor of the Jews. Of the Christians. He believes that this is a rebel movement, an offshoot, an invalid, and something that just has to be wiped out. And so he witnesses the stoning and killing of Stephen, the apostle Stephen. He confronts lots of people, and finally he gets a letter from the Jewish leaders of Jerusalem to go to Damascus, which is in modern day Syria. And on the Damascus road, he's going to Damascus to find, to capture, to bind up, and to bring back for trial any Christians he might find. I mean, this is real stuff. And on the way to Damascus, he is struck as if by lightning and hears the voice that he absolutely, with every fiber of his being, realizes is the risen Christ. Now, not Jesus, the person who walked around, but the risen Christ, because this is, of course, post-resurrection and post-ascension. And the voice says to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why do you chase after me? And when he says, who is this? The voice says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Go into the city, and you will be told what to do. And Saul gets up and realizes he can no longer see. He has something like scales on his eyes, and he has to be led. This man who was going to be destructive is led to the house of a willing but reluctant apostle who says to God when called, Ananias says, God, this guy is trying to kill us. Why are you sending him to us? And the voice of Christ, of God, known Father, Son, and Spirit now, all three persons of manifestations of God, says, don't worry about it. It will be okay. He has seen things. He has had a change of heart, and I will show him what he must suffer for my sake. And so Saul is baptized and becomes Paul. And Paul's mission is an interesting one because it is to the Gentile world. It is not to the Jewish world where the apostles have been working, but instead he is the first of a collection made known in Acts of Barnabas and some others of apostles of Christ who are called specifically to go to speak to Gentiles, to people who never knew, they never followed the law, were never circumcised, were never Jewish. And then there's a whole lot of chapters that deal with the whole controversy about, do you have to become Jewish in order to become Christian, which was not a big deal for the Jerusalem church, but was a huge deal for the Gentile church. First of all, because people didn't feel that they wanted necessarily to undergo circumcision, but even more importantly, because the apostles reported all of these acts of the Holy Spirit, these gifts of the Holy Spirit coming upon the people, these gifts of speaking in tongues, these gifts of outpourings of faith in ways that was undeniable, that they had already experienced the Holy Spirit, that they knew the risen Christ, even without the presence, even without being part of Judaism, even without witnessing it themselves. And Paul's mission into the Gentile world involves all sorts of, he's run out of town on rails, he's persecuted, he has huge debates in Athens, he has lots and lots of times where there are uproars, where he's thrown out of the synagogues and then he's thrown out of the city. And finally, he undertakes an ocean journey, a journey by boat across the Mediterranean. He's shipwrecked. Just lots and lots of stuff. It's quite a story. And he ends up not only founding quite a few churches, but also then supporting and fundraising for others. And we will get into that with the epistles. Meantime, the important thing to say about Paul is that he does not escape the penalties that come with being a Christian missionary. He is taken to Rome and arrested and put in prison, and he writes several of his letters are written from prison, and he talks about how he's in imprisonment, but he hopes to see people soon. As it happened, he ended up being martyred, as we know from the historical record, but he left a mark on the Christian world that is indisputable. He also wrote a lot of things that make a lot of people mad even today, and we'll get into that next time. But Paul is the reason that the church became something more than a Jewish sect in many senses. And it is even the churches that he didn't found, he wrote to, he supported, such as the church in Rome and the church in Corinth, and encouraged them. And he was really the first theologian. Now, the one thing that Acts doesn't have is a complete gospel of Paul. It's got several accounts of Paul's conversion, and I would love to have known his stump speech, what it was that he said when he went into these synagogues, how it is exactly that he preached and unwrapped this argument in a way that caused so many to hear it and then believe. But we don't have it. We have Peter's, we have Stephen's, but we don't have Paul's. However, you can really kind of sense some of it by looking through the book of Acts. So that's what I have to say about the book of Acts. It is sometimes a really neglected part of the New Testament. We tend to jump to favorite parts, which I understand it. I've done it too. As a preacher, I have to make selections of texts that are going to really teach people, especially people who may not necessarily have had a lot of exposure to details of the Bible. And you pick your battles. You pick which things you're going to use, and very often Acts gets subsumed into other things. But I encourage you. It's basically 28 chapters. You could read it in a probably a 2-week period by just reading a couple of chapters every day. You might get caught up like the teenagers did in reading the whole thing straight through. But it's an important book because without it, the letters of Paul would not have their connection with the gospel in the way that they do when you hear his story. And the letters of Peter would not have the same connection if you did not have this story where we see Peter transformed, completely made into a different person. And perhaps most importantly, the book of Acts really is Acts of the Holy Spirit. And it highlights and brings back to mind and reminds all of us that it is the work of the Spirit that rises up within us, that changes hearts and minds, that gives us gifts to use in community, always in community, that gives us what we need to endure what we must endure for the sake of the gospel. And so it's an essential part, an essential cog in the wheel. I thank you for joining me. As always, it's really fun to talk about all these Bible things. We're going to go into the letters of Paul, and I'm going to do them in several parts because particularly his first letter, the letter to the Romans, is super important in Christian theology and certainly in Protestant Christian theology, and has been so often cherry-picked and misused and so on. So what I want to remind us, now that we've hit this point, is that everything that we as Christians, as followers of Jesus, experience in the Bible, that we see, that we find, needs to be seen in the light of the gospel. In the light of the gospel, we see the book of Acts. In the light of the gospel, we see the teachings of Paul. In the lighting of the gospel, we see the revelations of the apocalypse, of the book of Revelation. It is not that we see the gospel in the light of these other things, right? They don't shed light. It is the gospel itself, the good news of Christ's life, teachings, work, death, resurrection, that informs everything else. And so I will tell you what Paul says effectively a number of different ways, but what we say frequently here at North Church is when you're in doubt about how to appreciate a text, how to see something, remember this. Remember my little hand making the light of the gospel shining on everything else. And when in doubt, go with Jesus. And so until next time, God be with you.